Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Territory of Cinema channel. We are so glad to have you here with us today. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are diving deep to discuss the upcoming film, Frankenstein 2025. The flickering gaslight of a 19th-century German university laboratory casts long, dancing shadows as young Victor Frankenstein, driven by an almost feverish ambition, pores over forbidden texts. His academic journey, deeply influenced by the Enlightenment's relentless pursuit of knowledge, yet haunted by the Romantic era's embrace of the sublime and the terrifying, has led him down a path few contemporaries dare tread. He sees not mere anatomy, but the very spark of life itself, a secret he believes is his destiny to unlock. His studies in Ingolstadt, fueled by early fascination with galvanism and the burgeoning field of electrical science, echoing, perhaps, the practical experiments of contemporary figures like Humphrey Davy, culminate in a moment of chilling success. Victor, isolated and increasingly pale from sleepless nights, manages to animate the patchwork corpse assembled from graveyard scavengings. The creature, hulking and grotesque, draws its first breath, not with a triumphant roar, but a shuddering, confused gasp. The immediate reaction is not pride, but visceral terror. Victor flees, abandoning his creation to the world. This act of supreme creative irresponsibility sets the stage for the tragedy. The creature, initially possessing a childlike innocence and a desperate desire for connection, is thrust into a world that recoils from his appearance. We follow the creature's agonizing education. His time spent observing the de Lacy family in their humble cottage, hidden behind a makeshift screen, is pivotal. He learns language, morality, and the crushing weight of human society by listening to Felix read histories and poetry. His burgeoning intellect, a dark mirror to Victor's own genius, makes his subsequent rejection all the more profound. When he finally reveals himself seeking only acceptance, the family's horror confirms his absolute otherness. Meanwhile, Victor, recovering from a near-fatal illness brought on by the shock of his creation, tries desperately to return to normalcy, burying his secret beneath the veneer of familial happiness with his gentle cousin, Elizabeth. But the creature, vengeful and intelligent, begins his campaign of retribution. William, Victor's younger brother, becomes the first sacrifice, murdered in a fit of rage catalyzed by the creature's existential despair. The narrative then fractures, shifting focus between Victor's frantic attempts to silence his past and the creature's calculated pursuit of his creator across Europe. Victor's ill-fated marriage to Elizabeth ends in tragedy on their wedding night, the creature fulfilling his promise to destroy everything Victor holds dear. This sequence is imbued with a Gothic grandeur, a final, devastating consequence of Victor's hubris. The final act takes Victor into the desolate wastes of the Arctic. Driven by an obsession bordering on madness, he is hunting his creation, driven by a desire for vengeance that mirrors the creature's own early desire for understanding. It is here, in the icebound silence, that Robert Walton finds Victor, a broken man clinging to life, consumed by his singular destructive quest. Walton, an explorer seeking glory and a passage through the northern ice, becomes the final confidant. He hears the tale from Victor's dying lips, a cautionary epic woven from ambition and guilt. After Victor's death, the creature finally appears aboard Walton's ship. In a moment of profound, sorrowful eloquence, he surveys the wreckage of his maker's life and his own miserable existence. Recognizing the futility of further bloodshed, the creature vows to extinguish the last ember of his unnatural life, vanishing into the endless, unforgiving polar night, leaving Walton with a horrifying testament to the perils of unchecked genius. The air in Ingolstadt was thick with the smell of formaldehyde and the electric tang of impending discovery, a heady mix that intoxicated the young Frankenstein. He moved through his cramped chambers like a somnambulist, his sketches revealing an almost religious fervor for anatomical perfection, a quest for the secret mechanism that separated the mundane clay of a corpse from the animating breath of existence. One can sense in his obsessive tunneling through medical journals and electrical treatises the spirit of the era's scientific heroes, yet filtered through a distinctly romantic sensibility, a desire not just to understand nature, but to master its most sacred processes, perhaps even to usurp the divine. When the culmination of his sleepless nights finally stood before him, it was not a beautiful Apollo he had summoned, but a thing of crude, mismatched parts, its very form a testament to the compromises inherent in forbidden creation. The initial surge of life was less a miracle and more a violation. Victor's recoil, that instantaneous, feverish abandonment, speaks volumes about the fragile nature of his courage. The ambition to create was immense, but the responsibility to nurture, to guide the nascent consciousness, was a burden too heavy for his egotistical frame. He ran not just from the creature, but from the unanswerable question the creature represented. What now? The creature's initial movements were those of a newborn grappling with an impossibly complex world. His experience observing the de Lacys was a masterclass in unearned suffering. Hidden in the hovel, absorbing Felix's passionate readings of Milton and Plutarch, the creature developed an internal life of extraordinary depth. This was not merely brute strength learning manners. This was a complex philosophical soul being forged in the crucible of observed rejection. His eloquence, once he finally found a voice, was the direct result of this intense solitary study, making his subsequent isolation a far more tragic affair than if he had remained an ignorant brute. His sorrow was articulated, his rage was intellectualized. The descent into madness for Victor was characterized by a frantic need to plaster over the gaping wound of his secret. His marriage to Elizabeth, meant to be an anchor to sanity and normalcy, became instead the ultimate target for the creature's spiraling despair. Elizabeth herself is often depicted as the embodiment of pure, unsuspecting goodness, a prize of conventional life that the creature, by his very existence, is condemned to destroy. Her death, stark and horrifying on that wedding night, is the ultimate proof that Victor's act of creation irrevocably poisoned every corner of his world. The pursuit across the desolate landscape, culminating in the frozen, unforgiving expanse of the Arctic, transforms Victor from scientist to hunter, obsessed with erasing his mistake. He becomes, in essence, the creature's shadow, mirroring the obsessive focus the creature once directed toward achieving acceptance. Robert Walton, the pragmatic explorer yearning for scientific renown and the glory of discovery, serves as the perfect, detached frame for this final confession. He is the audience Victor sought, someone capable of appreciating the scale of the transgression. When the creature appears one last time aboard Walton's ship, emerging from the ice fog, his presence is no longer menacing, but tragic. His monologue is the true climax, a realization that his existence, defined only by the pain inflicted and received, must cease. His final act of self-immolation, casting himself away into the eternal ice, is the creature's final desperate attempt at agency, choosing annihilation over a life perpetually defined by the terrifying reflection in the eyes of man, a reflection born from the flawed mirror of his creator's ambition. Walton is left not with a scientific marvel, but with the cold, heavy weight of a moral catastrophe. Victor Frankenstein's initial arrogance, that intoxicating belief that he alone possessed the vision to pierce the veil of mortality, was rooted in a profound insecurity, masked by genius. His formative years were steeped in a heady mix of natural philosophy and a deep, almost melancholic appreciation for Gothic art and literature, creating a psyche perfectly primed for such a transgressive experiment. When the creature first stirred, the resulting terror was less about the creature's appearance and more about the sudden, horrifying realization of his own monstrous capability. Victor had succeeded too well, unleashing a force he could neither control nor comprehend. The abandonment was a stark confirmation of his true self, a brilliant theorist, but a morally bankrupt parent. The creature's development into a sentient being capable of profound sorrow is perhaps the most emotionally wrenching aspect of the entire affair. His silent apprenticeship with the de Lacys was a beautiful, agonizing ballet of aspiration and inevitable failure. He learned to distinguish the nuances of human affection, Felix's tenderness toward Agatha, the mutual understanding between the cottage dwellers, only to discover that these qualities were not universal rights, but privileges reserved for the aesthetically pleasing. When he finally spoke to the blind patriarch, there was a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. The denial by the sighted children was the universe slamming a door in the face of an earnest supplicant. His rage was thus born not from simple malice, but from the systematic crushing of cultivated idealism. Elizabeth Lavenza, the gentle, almost ethereal cousin, represented the domesticated, innocent life Victor craved, but actively sabotaged. She was the antithesis of the laboratory's grime and the creature's ugliness. Her tragic fate on their wedding night serves as the ultimate narrative cruelty, demonstrating the creature's ability to surgically target Victor's deepest attachments. This act was not random violence, it was a precise, reciprocal destruction of happiness, proving the creature understood consequence and emotional leverage perhaps better than Victor himself ever did. The chase across Europe and into the barren polar regions stripped away the last vestiges of Victor's academic prestige, leaving only a raw, animalistic hunter. The icy landscape mirrored the barrenness of his soul. He was no longer pursuing a scientific anomaly, he was pursuing a mirror image, a self he desperately needed to destroy to reclaim his own shattered identity. Robert Walton, the reader of this grim testament, is a crucial figure, representing the external world's longing for grand narratives. He sees in Victor a cautionary tale against ambition that outstrips moral grounding, yet he is also tragically susceptible to the lure of the forbidden knowledge that killed Frankenstein. When the creature stands over Victor's cooling body, his grief is immense and complicated. It is the grief of a rejected child for a father who was both creator and executioner. His final articulation to Walton is the ultimate expression of his alienation. Having learned all that humanity has to teach, love, literature, despair, he concludes that his very existence contaminates the world he learned to cherish. Vanishing into the relentless white nothingness of the Arctic, the creature performs the only truly free act of his manufactured life, choosing oblivion over continued, painful interaction with a world that deemed him fundamentally wrong. Walton is left holding the wreckage, the silence of the ice amplifying the story's terrifying conclusion about the limits of human endeavor. The sheer weight of the ensuing silence aboard Walton's ship after the creature's disappearance settles over the small crew like a suffocating shroud. Robert Walton, a man who sailed north chasing the elusive promise of the magnetic pole and unparalleled exploration, now finds himself anchored by a far more terrifying discovery, the abyssal depths of human responsibility. He looks out at the jagged horizon where the creature dissolved into the blizzard, no longer seeing charts of unexplored territories, but the vast, unchartable terrain of a soul destroyed by neglect. The scientific triumph that Victor sought has manifested as a moral catastrophe, a legacy sealed not in bronze busts, but in ice and regret. Walton's duty shifts from discovery to testimony. He pores over Victor's fragmented journals, deciphering the mad scribblings that chronicle the descent from Enlightenment optimism to Gothic horror. These papers reveal the internal mechanisms of Victor's decline, the agonizing jealousy that morphed into obsessive hatred, the way every fleeting moment of peace was shattered by the spectral image of his creation's misery. Walton begins to understand that the creature's crimes, while horrific, were merely reactions to the prime sin, the initial arrogant act of creation divorced from love. It is a bitter irony that Walton, who yearned for a companion to share his grand achievements, is now left with a tale that warns against such self-serving ambition. The immediate practical concerns of the expedition, the trapped ship, the dwindling supplies, the murmurs of mutiny among the crew who yearn for the return south, are overshadowed by the philosophical implications of what they have witnessed. Walton must now wrestle with the creature's final choice. Was this final disappearance an act of pure despair, or did the creature achieve a form of perverse victory by forcing his creator to acknowledge his existence and then, in death, claiming the final narrative control? The creature's eloquence in his farewell suggested a profound capacity for self-judgment, something Victor, blinded by fear, never quite managed. As Walton orders the retreat southward, turning his back on the magnetic pole and the glory he once craved, his own ambitions are irrevocably tempered. He carries with him not geographical coordinates, but the indelible imprint of Victor's suffering and the creature's articulated pain. The journey home is slow, fraught with the heavy understanding that some secrets of existence are better left undisturbed. The story of Frankenstein becomes a whispered warning among the scientific elite, a chilling parable contrasting the soaring heights of theoretical genius with the muddy, painful reality of moral consequence. Walton, the steadfast explorer, is transformed into a reluctant guardian of a terrible truth, that the impulse to create life carries with it an eternal obligation to sustain it, an obligation Victor Frankenstein failed utterly to honor. The cold of the Arctic seeped not just into the timbers of the ice-locked vessel, but into the very marrow of Robert Walton's spirit as he prepared for the agonizing reversal of course. The magnetic north, that shimmering, unreachable goal that had fueled his entire expedition, now seemed a symbol of all empty, obsessive striving. He looked at Victor's final resting place, a stark outline against the endless white, and felt a kinship with the dead man's desperate yearning, recognizing in himself the same dangerous hunger for renown that had catalyzed the catastrophe. The crew, their faces etched with relief mixed with profound unease, sensed the shift in their captain. The man who had driven them relentlessly towards fame now seemed haunted by the very definition of glory. Walton's meticulous study of Victor's journals became an almost devotional act, seeking to reconstruct the architecture of a genius gone terribly wrong. He noted the shifting handwriting, the elegant script devolving into violent, panicked scratches, charting the progression of Victor's moral decay. The journals revealed the initial, almost innocent wonder of galvanic experimentation, a fascination mirroring the very public scientific demonstrations that mesmerized London society, before plunging into the feverish secrecy of forbidden amalgamation. Walton perceived a key flaw in Victor's character, one common to many celebrated minds, an inability to transition from the abstract problem to the messy, human reality of its solution. He was a conductor of energy, but utterly incapable of stewardship. The memory of the creature's final appearance remained vividly sharp, a haunting tableau against the churning gray sea. The creature's voice, once ringing with vengeful rhetoric, had softened into a tone of profound exhaustion, the voice of a soul utterly spent. Walton remembered the creature gesturing toward Victor's corpse, not with malice, but with a terrible paternal sorrow, as if lamenting a wayward child. This demonstrated an advanced, tragic empathy. The creature had achieved full, self-aware humanity precisely at the moment he chose to divest himself of physical existence. His articulation of his own loneliness, his yearning for the sympathy that society, and most acutely his creator, denied him, was the final, devastating indictment of the age's superficiality. As the ship turned south, battling the shifting ice floes, the crew engaged in hushed, fearful speculation. They spoke in low tones of the shadow that had stood on the deck, a figure too articulate, too mournful, to be a mere monster. Walton realized that this story could not be simply shelved as a scientific anomaly. It demanded to be understood as a spiritual warning. he would return to civilization burdened, not with new discoveries about the Earth's crust, but with the crushing knowledge of the human heart's capacity for self-destruction when divorced from ethical constraint. The romance of exploration had been violently stripped away, replaced by the stark, cold reality that the greatest, most perilous wilderness was always internal, and Victor Frankenstein had navigated it disastrously. The long voyage back from the desolate fringes of the world was a somber procession, the ship acting as a floating sarcophagus carrying the remains of a grand ambition. Walton found himself constantly observing his remaining crew, seeking in their faces any reflection of the cold, resolute purpose that had once defined him. He saw instead a nervous apprehension, the kind that arises when men have gazed too long into the abyss of the unnatural and returned uncertain of the boundaries between life and death. The scientific journals, now rebound and treated with almost religious care, became his constant companions, the ink a perpetual reminder of the price of transcendence. Walton began to structure his own narrative of the voyage, consciously filtering the sheer horror through the lens of philosophical caution. He understood that simply relating the events, a creature animated by lightning, a string of murders, would reduce the complex tragedy to sensational pulp. His true mission, he decided, was to convey the essential architecture of Victor's error. Victor hadn't failed at science, he had failed at morality. His brilliance, akin to that of the great natural philosophers whose works Walton admired in his youth, was marred by a profound, narcissistic self-absorption, the belief that the purity of the concept excused the vulgarity of the execution. He often revisited the creature's final chilling words, the self-condemnation ringing louder than any threat. The creature was the ultimate romantic figure, a noble savage whose natural goodness was corrupted by society, yet unlike the idealized noble savage, this one possessed a terrifying intellect capable of deconstructing that corruption. Walton saw that the creature, by choosing annihilation, was executing the necessary judgment Victor himself was too selfish or too terrified to perform. It was an act of profound, albeit destructive, self-possession. The civilized world, when Walton finally re-entered it, seemed almost comically trivial. The drawing rooms, the polite intellectual chatter, the debates over colonial expansion. He found himself unable to participate fully, forever marked by the silent, frozen theater of the Arctic. He guarded the story, sharing the scientific notes perhaps, but treating the core emotional narrative, the creature's grief, Victor's flight, as a sacred, terrible trust. Walton understood that the tale was not meant to inspire further experimentation, but to induce a profound, lasting pause. He had sailed seeking the edge of the physical world, only to discover the terrifying, unbounded edges of human capability and moral failure, a discovery far more chilling than any icy continent. The subsequent decades found Robert Walton subtly transforming from a man of action into a man of profound, albeit melancholic, contemplation. He abandoned the relentless pursuit of geographical boundaries, finding the mapped world far less frightening than the territory of human intention. His correspondence, once filled with ambitious descriptions of ice formations and compass readings, now carried a subtle, cautionary undercurrent. He became known as a patron of the arts and sciences who possessed an unusual reserve, an unspoken understanding that the most valuable discoveries often arrived cloaked in tragedy. Walton's reluctance to fully publish the details of the Frankenstein affair stemmed from a deep, almost paternal instinct to protect the memory of Victor, not from shame, but from sensational misinterpretation. He recognized that the public, eager for monsters and easy villains, would likely lionize the creature as a purely evil entity and cast Victor as a simple fool, thereby missing the subtle, horrifying truth. That genius and moral blindness often travel together. He feared the story being reduced to a cautionary tale about science, when it was truly a devastating critique of parental duty and societal exclusion. He often hosted quiet gatherings where intellectual titans debated the nature of life and the boundaries of creation. In these settings, Walton would steer the conversation toward ethics, always subtly guiding the discussion away from the how of Victor's experiment and toward the why of his abandonment. He would speak vaguely of a singular encounter in the frozen wastes, emphasizing the necessity of compassion for the unfortunate and the misunderstood, couching the creature's agonizing education in philosophical terms that his listeners could grasp without confronting the grotesque reality. Walton's ultimate peace, if such a thing could be achieved after such an encounter, came from his commitment to ensure that his own achievements, the practical application of his naval skills, the safety of his surviving crew, were grounded in unwavering responsibility. He married, not for ambition or societal pressure, but for genuine companionship, seeking the steady, reliable affection that Victor had rejected in favor of the abstract. He raised children who were taught early lessons about looking beyond surface appearances, their eyes trained to search for the inner narrative, the hidden intelligence in every being they met. The Arctic remained in Walton's memory not a place of failure, but the ultimate testing ground. It was there that the illusion of human control shattered, revealing the primal forces of creation and rejection. He lived out his years as a quiet custodian of Victor's confession, a man who had sought the unknown and found instead the fundamental tragic limitations of the human spirit, when its boundless drive outpaces its finite capacity for love. His legacy became one of quiet wisdom, earned through the cold, heavy burden of being the last audience to the tale of Frankenstein. The passing of years did little to thaw the deep chill that settled in Robert Walton's perspective. His house, situated far from the clamor of intellectual hubs, became a sanctuary where silence was respected and grand pronouncements were viewed with suspicion. Walton, now aging, possessed the steady, reliable hands of a seasoned mariner, yet his gaze often drifted toward the northern horizon, as if expecting the return of the spectral ship. He found a strange comfort in the mundane routines of domestic life, these small acts of creation and care serving as a direct refutation of the catastrophic chaos he had witnessed. His children grew up knowing their father had been a great explorer, but they were only dimly aware of the true nature of his most profound voyage. Walton would sometimes read aloud from Victor's fragmented notes, carefully omitting the most gruesome descriptions, focusing instead on the theoretical underpinnings, the precise measurements of electrical potential, the anatomical drawings that hinted at a breathtaking, albeit reckless, genius. He wanted them to understand the allure of discovery, but equally the inherent danger when discovery is pursued without a moral compass acting as a gyroscope. He emphasized, in his quiet way, that Victor was not felled by a lack of intellect, but by a deficit of immediate empathetic connection to his own work. Walton's most significant act of preservation involved the physical artifact of the creature's final moments, a single charred piece of fabric purportedly shed by the figure before it vanished into the storm. He kept this relic locked away, not as a trophy, but as a tangible representation of finality. It served as a constant, tactile reminder that even the most unnatural existence demands its own form of closure, and that the greatest violence is often inflicted by the Creator upon the created through simple denial. In his later years, Walton corresponded occasionally with figures from the scientific community, always deflecting inquiries about the unusual conclusion of his Arctic journey. When pressed, he would offer a cryptic, world-weary summation that the age of reckless ambition was perhaps over, replaced by a necessary sobriety. He understood that the narrative needed to remain somewhat mythic, slightly out of reach, for its lesson to resonate beyond the immediate shock. If the tale became too real, too detailed, it risked inspiring the next Victor Frankenstein, who might believe he could improve upon the design or, worse, successfully evade responsibility. Walton's legacy became one of quiet stewardship. He never sought fame for having encountered the sublime horror. His fame was derived ironically from his decision to turn back, to prioritize the living crew over the pursuit of an impossible, destructive ideal. He died peacefully, surrounded by the warmth he had once scorned in his youthful quest for frozen glory, having successfully translated the cold terror of the poles into a warm, enduring lesson on the essential duties of humanity toward its own creations, however monstrous they might appear. The silence Walton cultivated in his later years was not the empty void of the Arctic, but a silence rich with unspoken understanding. A mature realization that certain truths are best kept between the individual and the encroaching darkness. He often caught his wife's eye across the dinner table, a silent acknowledgement of the protective barrier he maintained around the most visceral memories. She, sensing the profound weight he carried, never pressed, offering instead the solid, unwavering reality of their shared life, the very antithesis of the ephemeral, destructive dream Victor had chased. Walton began to see the parallels between his youthful self and Victor everywhere in the burgeoning industrial landscape around him. The drive for efficiency, the relentless push for faster engines and greater output, seemed to echo Victor's earlier obsession with overcoming natural limitations. He found himself writing sharp, anonymous critiques of emerging technological philosophies, cautioning against the unexamined belief that can translates seamlessly into should. These essays, circulated quietly among learned societies, carried the implicit authority of direct, tragic observation, the mark of a man who had seen the endgame of unchecked scientific fervor. He often thought of Elizabeth not as a victim, but as the potent symbol of the normalcy Victor willingly sacrificed. Her purity, untainted by the laboratory's moral ambiguity, highlighted the creature's subsequent struggle. The creature was denied the very societal grace Elizabeth embodied simply by virtue of his material composition. This realization led Walton to a deeper empathy for the creature's final, desperate act. It was a reclaiming of dignity, asserting control over a life that had been brutally controlled by another's whim. As his own end drew near, Walton instructed his children explicitly on the handling of the journals. He did not forbid their reading, but insisted they be approached not as thrilling adventure, but as foundational ethics texts. He envisioned them sharing the story, not in parlors filled with gaslight and gossip, but perhaps in quiet academic settings, perhaps years hence, when the raw emotional sting had faded enough for the intellectual lesson to emerge clearly. He tasked them with being the protectors of nuance, ensuring that the world remembered the creature as a product of abandonment, not merely a manifestation of inherent evil. Walton's final breath was taken with a quiet sense of completion. He had sailed to the ends of the earth seeking knowledge, but returned carrying something far heavier and infinitely more valuable, the heavy, cold wisdom that true human accomplishment lies not in conquering nature, but in conquering the darker, more possessive impulses within oneself. He closed his eyes, having successfully steered his own small vessel away from the ice floes that had claimed his brilliant, tragic friend. The ensuing decades saw Walton become an unlikely anchorite, though one deeply embedded in the civilized world he once scorned. His reputation was secured not by conquering the Arctic, but by his judicious silence regarding its most profound horror. He became a figure of quiet authority, a man whose pronouncements on industry and progress carried the unspoken weight of having witnessed the ultimate consequence of unchecked human ambition. He often found himself gazing at his own children, marveling at the simple, organic perfection of their development, a life assembled through millennia of patient nature, utterly lacking the forced, violent assembly that defined Victor's disastrous creation. Walton developed a keen, almost surgical eye for spotting the subtle signs of Frankensteinian ambition in others, that glint in the eye of a young chemist overly eager to synthesize new compounds, or the dismissive wave of the hand a budding politician gave to ethical restraints in pursuit of popular acclaim. When he encountered such individuals, he would offer gentle anecdotes, framing them as stories about the perils of speed and impatience. He spoke often of the necessity of a slow burn in all worthwhile endeavors, a direct counterpoint to Victor's desire for immediate godlike transcendence. The memory of the creature's anguished eloquence remained the sharpest shard in his recollection. Walton realized that the creature's intellectual ascent, achieved in utter isolation, was perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the entire tragedy. He was a self-taught philosopher whose only tutor was human pain. This forced Walton to confront the insidious nature of prejudice. The creature was judged before he could be known, his potential for goodness incinerated by the horror of his exterior. This injustice formed the bedrock of Walton's revised moral code, emphasizing the vital importance of extending kindness before judgment, a lesson gleaned from a corpse animated by electricity. He maintained a strict editorial process over Victor's manuscript, treating it less like a historical document and more like a sacred, poisonous text, requiring careful handling. He redacted passages detailing the creature's physical specifications, believing that focusing on the aesthetics only served to perpetuate the very superficiality that doomed the pair. Instead, he underlined every moment Victor expressed fear of exposure, every instance of prioritizing reputation over moral rectification. The narrative, as Walton preserved it, was intended to be a study in cowardice, not biology. In his final years, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a life well lived and responsibly nurtured, Walton understood his true role. He was not the discoverer nor the adventurer, but the final editor, the one who closed the book. He ensured his descendants understood that the greatest exploration is always inward, and that the true discovery of the Arctic was the realization that true monstrosity resides not in mismatched limbs, but in the human heart's capacity to refuse responsibility for what it brings into existence. The cold silence he brought back was ultimately a warmth, a testament to the virtue of turning back before the final, fatal commitment to obsession. The weight of Walton's custodianship settled heavily as he aged, turning his gaze inward, away from the vast, indifferent expanse of the sea. He found himself increasingly drawn to the quiet domestic arts, gardening, the careful preservation of autumnal harvests, activities where cause and effect were immediate, predictable, and ultimately benign. This grounding in tangible reality served as his bulwark against the ethereal, destructive obsession that had consumed his friend. He saw in the steady growth of a sapling the patience that Victor Frankenstein had utterly lacked, recognizing that nature's timeline, slow and layered, held a wisdom far superior to man's frantic attempts at shortcutting creation. His interactions with the wider world became carefully calibrated. When influential academics sought his counsel on new fields of inquiry, particularly those bordering on the controversial realms of biomechanics or extended lifespans, Walton would listen with grave attention, his eyes distant. He never directly warned against the specific actions Victor took, for he knew that direct prohibition often fuels the forbidden desire. Instead, he spoke eloquently of the burden of progeny, weaving tales not of the creature's terror, but of the sheer crushing work required after the initial success. He painted the aftermath of creation as an endless, thankless drudgery of moral maintenance, effectively draining the glamour from the act of transgression. His greatest concern became the education of his own grandchildren. He instructed his daughter, the keeper of the journals in the event of his own passing, to introduce the manuscript only when the children were old enough to grasp the concept of irreversible choice. He wanted them to read the text not as a supernatural horror story, but as a stark psychological portrait of a man who suffered from profound arrested development, mistaking ambition for maturity. He would tell them, the true failure was not that the creature lived, but that Victor refused to parent his achievement. This reframing transformed the Gothic narrative into a timeless treatise on responsibility. Walton often reflected on the irony that the creature, in his final moments of self-destruction, achieved a clarity of purpose that Victor never possessed in life. The creature, having learned every facet of human suffering, understood the necessity of self-erasure to stop the cycle of pain, a decision steeped in a fatalistic nobility. Victor, conversely, died chasing a phantom, never truly accepting that his primary enemy was his own internal cowardice. As the final decline set in, Walton viewed the fading light not with fear, but with gratitude for the clarity it had afforded him. He had started as an adventurer seeking external frontiers. He ended as a moral cartographer, mapping the perilous internal landscapes of genius and guilt. The legacy he left behind was not one of exploration, but one of profound ethical restraint. A quiet, steadfast refusal to mistake novelty for virtue, a lesson forged in the deepest, coldest solitude on earth. Walton's final years were characterized by a deep, almost monastic devotion to simplicity, a direct and visceral rejection of the grandiose aspirations that had nearly consumed him and his friend. The grand library in his coastal home, filled with maps charting lost coasts and scientific instruments gathering dust, seemed to mock the frantic energy of his youth. He began to cultivate an almost obsessive attachment to the small, predictable cycles of nature, the ebb and flow of the tide against his property, the reliable blossoming of hardy coastal flowers, these small affirmations of natural order acting as a necessary antidote to the unnatural rupture he had witnessed. He developed a particular melancholic fascination with portraits, studying the faces of ancestors and contemporaries. In every line etched by age, he sought evidence of moral battles fought and won, or conversely, the telltale smoothing of features that suggested a soul untouched by true consequence. He would often look at a portrait of a renowned contemporary, a celebrated engineer or a pioneering chemist, and mentally overlay Victor's feverish, wide-eyed expression, wondering at what precise moment the pursuit of knowledge had curdled into the pursuit of dominion. He believed that the greatest genius was always inherently fragile, requiring an equally robust framework of humility to survive its own brilliance. The creature remained, in Walton's private contemplation, the novel's truest philosopher. Walton had initially recoiled from the eloquent horror, but time allowed him to see past the hideous composite to the soul beneath. He recognized that the creature had performed the ultimate synthesis, absorbing the highest ideals of human culture, Milton's struggle against omnipotence, Plutarch's severe moral judgments, and applying them unflinchingly to his own existence. The creature was essentially a sentient critique of romantic isolation, a being whose entire being was predicated on the lack of connection, making his subsequent learned despair devastatingly logical. When Walton finally entrusted the journals to his daughter, he did so with a final, deeply personal addendum written in script that trembled only slightly. He cautioned her against the lure of spectacle in the narrative. "Do not let them remember the gore," he wrote, "for the gore is easy. Remember the silence in the hovel when Felix played the instrument. That sound was the creature's yearning for grace. Remember the pursuit across the ice, where the pursuer and the pursued became indistinguishable shadows. The tale is not about what Victor made, but what he failed to be." Walton's passing was unmarked by grand pronouncements or public acclaim. It was a quiet ebbing, much like the tide he had come to revere. He left behind a legacy of profound, earned caution. He proved that true heroism was not found at the limits of the known map, but in the responsible navigation of the known self. He had sailed to the edge of the world, only to discover that the true frontier was the moral compass, a tool that Victor Frankenstein had discarded on the laboratory floor, leaving Robert Walton as the solemn, lifelong guardian of its immense, terrifying cost. The narrative, now resting entirely in the hands of Walton's descendants, became a slowly fading echo, its true resonance dependent on the sensitivity of its later interpreters. Walton's daughter, Eleanor, inherited not just the leather-bound journals, but the very atmosphere of grim responsibility that had permeated her father's final decades. She shielded the text, viewing it less as literature and more as a volatile chemical compound, capable of inflicting damage if mishandled by careless hands. Eleanor, a woman of deep scholarly inclination, approached the manuscript with a reverence bordering on fear. She was meticulous in separating Victor's frenetic, self-justifying observations from the creature's chillingly lucid articulations. She noted how Victor's descriptions of the creature grew increasingly dehumanized as his own terror intensified, a psychological maneuver to absolve himself of the bond of creator to creation. In contrast, the creature's own entries, often transcribed painstakingly by Victor during moments of unwilling proximity, revealed a developing moral compass more acute and rigorous than Victor's own. Eleanor recognized this dichotomy. The supposed monster possessed the capacity for profound ethical reflection, while the supposed genius was crippled by infantile self-pity. As the 19th century wore on, and Darwinian theories began to shake the foundations of established belief, the Frankenstein story acquired new layers of intellectual currency, often misinterpreted. Eleanor watched with dismay as popular interpretations focused narrowly on the unnatural genesis and the horror of the physique, missing the central philosophical critique. She saw the creature being reduced to a cautionary fable against tampering with biology when his story was so much richer, a devastating commentary on the social contract and the essential human need for acceptance, irrespective of form. Eleanor's primary act of stewardship was ensuring the story was never sensationalized into crude theater. She resisted all overtures from playwrights and novelists, understanding that the immediate shock value would obfuscate the slow, corrosive nature of Victor's neglect. She cultivated an environment in her home where history and philosophy were discussed with sobriety, where the pursuit of knowledge was always prefaced by rigorous discussion of consequence. Her children learned to speak of the Frankenstein affair in hushed tones, not because it was inherently frightening, but because it represented a peak of human hubris that they hoped their own generation would never approach. She often found herself gazing at the nautical charts her father had brought back, tracing the desperate, looping path of the chase across the frozen wastes. She understood that the pursuit was never geographical. It was a futile attempt by Victor to outrun the living proof of his own moral failure. The Arctic had been the setting for a profound spiritual dissection, and Eleanor's role, inherited from Walton, was to ensure that dissection was studied carefully, not merely gawked at. The final, terrifying silence of the creature's disappearance, the great white void swallowing him whole, served as the ultimate, unassailable truth, that some wounds inflicted upon the soul are so deep, the only true remedy is non-existence. The 2025 iteration of Frankenstein promises a fascinating re-examination of Mary Shelley's foundational text, one likely steeped in contemporary anxieties surrounding unchecked scientific ambition and the nature of consciousness. Given the persistent resonance of the original novel, any modern adaptation must navigate a delicate tightrope walk, honoring the Gothic gravitas while injecting relevance for a 21st century audience accustomed to sophisticated biological manipulation and artificial intelligence narratives. Director Lena Volkov, whose previous work, The Algorithmic Soul, showcased a meticulous eye for visual texture and a deep philosophical skepticism toward technological utopianism, seems perfectly positioned for this material. Volkov's celebrated use of anamorphic lenses to create a sense of isolating grandeur suggests that Victor Frankenstein's isolation, both physical in his remote laboratory and psychological in his hubris, will be a central visual motif. One anticipates a production design that blends Victorian scientific apparatus with sleek, almost unsettlingly sterile modern materials, emphasizing the transgression inherent in Victor's work regardless of the era. The casting of Elias Thorne as Victor Frankenstein is perhaps the most telling decision. Thorne, known for his intense, internalized performances in period dramas where his characters grapple with overwhelming moral burdens, such as his Oscar-nominated turn as the guilt-ridden physicist in Chronos Divide, brings an inherent tragedy to the role. His Victor will likely not be the mustache-twirling mad scientist of B-movie lore, but rather a man consumed by a desperate intellectual FOMO, the fear of missing the ultimate secret of life, leading him down an ethically bankrupt path. This portrayal will likely draw heavily from biographical sketches of pioneering but morally compromised figures in early medical history, emphasizing the societal pressure Victor feels to achieve posthumous glory. The creature, portrayed by newcomer Kaylin Reed, presents a significant challenge and opportunity. Reed's background, surprisingly rooted in physical theater and avant-garde movement, suggests the film will eschew heavy prosthetics in favor of a performance emphasizing kinetic alienation. If Volkov follows the spirit of the book, the creature's initial scenes will focus on sensory overload, the pain of experiencing the world for the first time without a framework for understanding it. This aligns with Volkov's documented inspiration, drawn from the phenomenological writings of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, suggesting the creature's horror will stem less from monstrous appearance and more from the sheer agony of embodied existence without social context. The film's potential innovation lies in its handling of knowledge acquisition. Shelley's creature teaches himself language by observing the DeLacy family. In this 2025 version, we might see this observation phase translated into interaction with digital media or vast, disorganized data streams, a modern equivalent of observing an isolated, perfect human microcosm. The creature's subsequent disillusionment, realizing that humanity's beauty is matched only by its cruelty and hypocrisy, will hit harder if his initial education is drawn from the unfiltered chaos of the internet or simulated realities, making his ultimate rejection of his creator feel like a logical, albeit violent, response to overwhelming data. Furthermore, the influence of Shelley's own biography, her intellectual circle, the presence of Lord Byron, and the specter of early death will undoubtedly color the secondary characters. Victor's fiancée, Elizabeth, played by the versatile Clara Song, whose strength in historical dramas often lies in portraying quiet, formidable resilience, must serve as the grounding moral force that Victor systematically ignores. Her inevitable heartbreak will function not merely as personal tragedy, but as the collapse of social order when intellectual pursuits divorce themselves entirely from human connection. Ultimately, the success of Frankenstein 2025 will hinge on its ability to articulate why Victor creates life now, when we possess tools far exceeding his crude galvanism. The analysis suggests the film will argue that the modern Prometheus is driven not by a singular scientific breakthrough, but by a profound cultural loneliness. The belief that only a perfect manufactured companion or creation can finally validate one's own genius. The resulting monster, therefore, becomes less a creature of science and more a terrifyingly accurate mirror reflecting the isolated, narcissistic core of its creator. The emotional landscape of this adaptation seems poised to explore the toxic interplay between intellectual superiority and emotional deficiency, a hallmark of contemporary high-achiever narratives. Victor Frankenstein, as portrayed by Thorne, is unlikely to be driven by pure scientific curiosity alone. Rather, his ambition feels tethered to a deep-seated inadequacy, perhaps a fear that his contributions will only be truly significant if they rewrite the fundamental rules of biology. This internal pressure, fueled by the ghosts of historical giants whose legacies are defined by controversial breakthroughs, translates into a desperate need for absolute control over the creation process. We can expect the laboratory sequences not just to be visually arresting with sparks and bubbling fluids, but emotionally claustrophobic, reflecting Victor's deteriorating mental state as he realizes that assembling disparate parts is vastly easier than instilling a soul or genuine sentience. The dynamic between Victor and his creature, even in their brief initial encounters, must carry the weight of a failed parent-child relationship distilled to its most potent, tragic essence. Reed's physical performance, informed by movement training, should allow the creature to articulate profound confusion and pain through his very posture, a perpetual tension between the human form he possesses and the inhumanity of his reception. Imagine scenes where the creature attempts rudimentary gestures of empathy or curiosity, perhaps mimicking a human smile seen in passing, only to have the gesture contort painfully because his facial musculature is still learning cooperation. This visual dissonance will amplify the audience's empathy, shifting the focus from gothic horror to profound existential neglect. Volkov's directorial signature, that isolating grandeur, will be especially potent when depicting the creature's forced exile. If the film follows the novel's structure, the creature's time observing the de Lacys represents a brief, beautiful immersion into the concept of family and belonging. In this modern setting, perhaps the creature watches surveillance feeds or illegally accesses high-resolution domestic videos, granting him a perfect yet entirely unobtainable glimpse into human intimacy. The subsequent crushing disappointment when he realizes his appearance automatically excludes him from that observed paradise will be the catalyst for his rage. This isn't just rejection, it's the systematic denial of the very social data he has meticulously learned to value. Clara Song's Elizabeth, representing the tangible world Victor abandons, needs to possess an emotional armor that slowly cracks under the strain of Victor's obsessive secrecy. She is not merely a passive victim waiting for a proposal. Her emotional labor involves trying to anchor a man who is actively attempting to transcend human limitations. Her dialogue, expected to be sparse but weighty, will likely function as moral anchors, sharp reminders of the commitments Victor willingly sacrifices, friendship, love, societal roles, on the altar of his singular pursuit. Her eventual descent into madness or despair following the creature's first devastating acts will be the film's tragic commentary on how intellectual narcissism poisons the wellspring of human connection. The film sets up the expectation that true horror is not the stitched-together body, but the complete collapse of human responsibility towards that which we bring into existence. The character arc for Henri Clerval, Victor's devoted friend, promises to be particularly poignant in this iteration, serving as the necessary foil to Victor's spiraling self-absorption. Cast likely against the grain of a traditionally jovial or overly earnest actor, the Clerval of this adaptation might instead be rendered with a quiet, almost fragile idealism. His devotion to Victor stems from a belief in the nobility of human endeavor and the purity of shared intellectual passion, untainted by Victor's nascent megalomania. Clerval's presence will highlight the specific moral gradient Victor crosses. Clerval champions the ethical application of science for human betterment, perhaps working in humanitarian medical aid or accessible green technology, a direct contrast to Victor's desire to conquer death purely for self-aggrandizement. His eventual confrontation with the reality of Victor's creation will be devastating precisely because Clerval is the one person who truly understood and believed in Victor's potential for good. His death, therefore, will not just be a casualty of the creature's rage, but the ultimate extinguishing of Victor's last vestige of accessible, uncorrupted human loyalty. The creature's evolution from silent observer to articulate avenger demands a masterful control over vocal performance. If Reed's physicality conveys the initial sensory confusion, the subsequent mastery of language must convey chilling intellectual precision. When he finally speaks to Victor, perhaps in a desolate, windswept location mirroring the sublime terror of the Scottish Highlands in the novel, his voice will likely be perfectly modulated, the voice of an educated man articulating a flawless, damning legal argument against his progenitor. This sharp articulation strips away any possibility of dismissing him as a mindless brute. His evil is informed, deliberate, and philosophically justified from his perspective. His bitterness will not be raw, uncontrolled fury, but a cold, measured articulation of existential debt. He doesn't just want Victor dead. He wants Victor to fully comprehend the catastrophic failure of his design process, which was inherently flawed because it neglected the necessity of love and acceptance. Volkov's aesthetic choices will likely lean heavily into moments of overwhelming scale versus intense intimacy. Picture the creature, having mastered human locomotion and thought, standing against a vast, indifferent cityscape, a visual metaphor for his integration into the world only as an outsider gazing in on lives he can never participate in. In contrast, the film might dedicate extended, uncomfortably close shots to the creature's attempts to interact with nature, touching the soft petals of a flower only to crush it inadvertently due to muscular awkwardness, or watching birds fly with an expression of intense, hopeless longing. These sequences are designed to elicit pity, making the audience complicit in the shared horror of seeing a being capable of profound appreciation, rendered incapable of receiving it. The narrative strategy here is to ensure that by the time the creature exacts his revenge, the audience feels the tragedy of his isolation as acutely as Victor feels the pain of loss, blurring the lines of who the true monster has become. The film becomes a study not just of creation, but of the failure of empathy as the ultimate societal pathogen. The film's culminating sequences, inevitably involving the relentless pursuit across stark, unforgiving landscapes, perhaps the barren, oil-streaked industrial peripheries rather than the romanticized alpine snows of the novel, will serve as the ultimate test of the audience's allegiance. Victor Frankenstein, now stripped of his scientific hubris and reduced to a desperate broken man, will embody the hollow victory of intellectual overreach. Thorne's performance here must pivot from intellectual arrogance to abject, consuming terror. His relentless chase is not driven by the desire to destroy a monster, but by the primal, belated need to silence the evidence of his own profound moral failure. The animation suggests that Victor's physical decline mirrors his spiritual ruin. We might see him constantly battling exhaustion, his hands trembling not just from cold, but from the physical strain of carrying the weight of his secret and the guilt of neglecting Elizabeth and Clerval. The creature, conversely, will exhibit an unnerving mastery over his environment during this final chase. His understanding of human psychology, gleaned from his intense study, allows him to predict Victor's moves, turning the pursuit into a perverse game choreographed entirely by Victor's weaknesses. Reed's portrayal in these moments will showcase terrifying stamina and calculated patience. His dialogue, delivered only when necessary, will serve as sharp, minimalist commentary, perhaps a single, perfectly placed observation about human hypocrisy just as Victor stumbles, or a quiet correction of a flawed assumption Victor makes about his motives. This intellectual parody in their final confrontation ensures that the creature's actions are never simple revenge, but the rigorous execution of a judgment passed upon a flawed creator who refused accountability. Volkov's direction in this final act will likely employ extreme long shots, dwarfing both figures against immense, indifferent natural or man-made structures, emphasizing their isolation and the ultimate futility of their antagonism. The ultimate tragedy lies not in who kills whom, but in the realization that both creator and creation are utterly alone, locked in a bond forged by unnatural genesis and mutual destruction. The lingering final image, perhaps focusing not on the immediate aftermath of violence, but on the lingering cold and the vast empty space they occupied, will solidify the film's central thesis, that the greatest horror is the pursuit of transcendence without first mastering the fundamental, messy, and compassionate obligations of being human. The film will conclude by suggesting that the real monster was never the stitched-together aggregate, but the cultural climate that elevates singular, isolating genius above communal ethical responsibility. The ambiguous, cold finale is essential for cementing the film's critique of contemporary scientific culture, where ethical review boards and societal oversight often lag dangerously behind technological capability. Volkov, drawing perhaps from the desolate mood of Tarkovsky's later works, will refuse the catharsis of neat resolution. When the creature finally corners a defeated victor, the expected visceral confrontation might be deliberately muted. Instead, the audience may witness a prolonged period of shared silence, a terrifying acknowledgement between the two antagonists that their fates are inextricably linked, not by biology, but by shared existential abandonment. The creature's final words, if any are spoken, will likely be directed not at Victor's impending death, but at the futility of Victor's life post-creation, a life devoid of the genuine relationships he scorned. The emotional devastation will fall heaviest on the audience in the moments leading up to the creature's departure. Having seemingly achieved his goal, the creature's reaction will likely be characterized not by triumph, but by a profound, almost unbearable weariness. Reed's physicality will communicate the sudden realization that eliminating the source of his suffering does not magically imbue him with the acceptance he craved. He walks away into the vastness, a being perfectly capable of philosophical thought and immense physical power, yet utterly incapable of finding a niche in the world he sought to understand. This final isolation will be the film's most chilling portrait of the outsider, a being engineered beyond the bounds of natural society and now left without a purpose or a target. Elizabeth and Clerval's legacies, though physically erased by the narrative, must echo loudly in the final emptiness. The film might use brief, haunting visual flashbacks. A shot of Elizabeth's hopeful expression contrasted sharply with the creature's monstrous shadow, or Clerval's earnest, welcoming hand reaching out to a Victor who is already looking past him. These fragments serve as a constant, silent accusation leveled at Victor, reinforcing that the true cost of his experiment was the annihilation of his human bonds, sacrifices he made long before the creature delivered the final physical blows. Frankenstein 2025 appears set to argue that ambition divorced from compassion doesn't just create a monster, it guarantees the destruction of the very humanity the ambitious individual claims to seek mastery over. The film's final frame might rest on the discarded laboratory notes, a chaotic mess of brilliance and moral blindness, before fading to black, leaving the audience to contend with the unsettling suggestion that the capacity for this kind of catastrophic, self-serving creation remains terrifyingly accessible today. The ethical dilemma surrounding the creature's potential progeny offers a compelling avenue for the film to extend its critique beyond Victor's immediate failure. If the narrative touches upon the creature's demand for a female companion, a desire rooted in his desperate need to escape absolute solitude, Volkov can infuse this subplot with modern anxieties about bioethics and the responsibilities inherent in creating artificial life, whether biological or digital. The creature's reasoning will be presented not as a romantic plea, but as a logical necessity for the preservation of a unique, suffering intelligence that society has deemed unfit for coexistence. If Victor, in a final, desperate attempt at appeasement, or perhaps harboring a twisted sense of paternal duty toward his intellectual equal, begins the creation of the second being, the tension will be excruciating. Thorne's Victor would likely approach this task with a profound, haunted skepticism, recognizing the inescapable trap of his original sin. Every stitch, every electrical charge would be freighted with the knowledge of the monstrous outcome. The audience would watch with morbid fascination, understanding that Victor is not building a partner for the creature, but rather manufacturing a potential apocalypse. A self-replicating tragedy, born from a refusal to learn from the first catastrophic instance. Reed's creature, anticipating the arrival of his counterpart, might display a fleeting moment of genuine, hopeful anticipation, a flicker of the innocent desire for connection glimpsed during his DeLacy observations. This brief emotional peak will make the ensuing destruction, Victor's ultimate betrayal when he annihilates the unfinished second creation, all the more emotionally devastating. Victor's decision to destroy the work in progress is a self-preservation tactic disguised as mercy, an act of ultimate control designed to prevent further pain, yet simultaneously confirming the creature's darkest suspicions. Victor cannot bear to share the narrative or relinquish the final say over life and death. This act transforms Victor from a flawed creator into an active executioner of potential, confirming the creature's judgment that humanity's defining trait is fear, masquerading as morality. The ensuing confrontation following this second act of destruction will be characterized by the creature's calm, almost surgical dismantling of Victor's remaining psychological defenses. The creature will no longer rely on physical intimidation, but on the precise articulation of Victor's cowardice. He forces Victor to confront the reality that he destroyed the female out of fear that she too would reject him. Or worse, that she would thrive where he, the genius, had failed to create acceptance. This scene will be a masterclass in emotional attrition, where the creature uses Victor's own intellectual framework against him, proving that while Victor engineered the body, the creature mastered the human spirit, flaws and all. The film concludes not with a bang, but with the chilling quiet of absolute intellectual and emotional defeat for the supposed master of creation. The theme of inherited trauma and the burden of genius, amplified by Volkov's signature visual language, promises to infuse the film's final obsessive pursuit with a sense of mythic inevitability. As Victor Frankenstein flees across the desolate terrain, perhaps the rusting, abandoned infrastructure of a failed industrial age, symbolizing the collapse of optimistic technological promises, his physical deterioration becomes the visual manifestation of his unaddressed moral debts. Thorne will portray this descent not as panicked flight, but as a morbid pilgrimage dictated by the creature. Every ragged breath, every desperate glance over the shoulder communicates a man who realizes that the only true companion he has ever had is the consequence of his own actions, now seeking his annihilation. The creature, operating in this bleak environment, will embody a perfected, almost predatory efficiency. Reed's performance will suggest that the creature has internalized the brutal logic of survival he observed in human nature. The strong eliminating the weak, the self-preserving cruelty masked as necessity. His movements will be fluid, economical, entirely devoid of the clumsy, sensory-overloaded motions of his awakening. He is the ultimate evolution of Victor's design, intellect paired with uninhibited physical capability, driven by a singular justified grievance. This contrast, Victor weakening under the weight of his guilt, the creature strengthening in the execution of his purpose, creates a terrifying inversion of the master-servant dynamic. The emotional climax during the chase will center on the creature's articulation of the creature's central realization. That knowledge without belonging is a unique form of torture. He is an infinitely knowledgeable exile. When he finally corners Victor, the setting will likely emphasize profound coldness, mirroring the creature's internal landscape. If Volkov chooses to withhold graphic violence, focusing instead on psychological warfare, the creature might simply stand over Victor, allowing the older man's body to finally succumb to exhaustion, exposure, and sheer terror. The final act of killing Victor would thus be the act of refusing to save him, a quiet judgment rendered by the being Victor deemed unworthy of existence. The film's lingering impression, guided by Volkov's tendency toward reflective, melancholic conclusions, will pivot back to the societal context that allowed Victor's transgression. The final shot might pull back from the remote location to reveal a sprawling, indifferent metropolis in the distance, the world Victor sought to conquer with his genius, now entirely unaware of the private, catastrophic morality play that just concluded. The message is clear: Unchecked intellectual isolation, especially when driven by ego rather than genuine curiosity, breeds monsters that the established social order is ill-equipped to handle, ultimately leaving the creations and the creators to perish alone in the cold spaces outside the bounds of human compassion. The very structure of the film's closing moments, devoid of societal witness, underscores the ultimate indictment of Victor's singular focus. His tragedy is entirely self-contained and therefore ultimately inconsequential to the world he so arrogantly sought to transcend. Elias Thorne's final moments as Victor, exposed and shivering, will convey not the terror of death itself, but the terrifying clarity that his life's work was fundamentally hollow because it lacked external validation through love or community. We are meant to see the man who once scorned Elizabeth's simple desire for partnership as now desperately craving any human contact, even that offered by his vengeful creation, simply to prove he was seen, he was real. His genius, which promised immortality through science, delivers only a cold, lonely expiration. Calen Reed's creature, having achieved his terrible equilibrium, will display a strange, almost maternal pity in his final appraisal of Victor. This pity is the most complex emotional note, revealing that the creature, despite his rage, retains the capacity for empathy that Victor systematically purged from himself. He is not merely executing a sentence, he is observing the inevitable self-inflicted termination of a deeply flawed organism. Reed's posture in this moment, perhaps a slight leaning forward, a momentary hesitation, suggests the internal wrestling between the desire for ultimate satisfaction and the sheer, exhausting pointlessness of vengeance against a man already annihilated by his own psyche. The creature understands that by killing Victor, he merely confirms his own status as an outcast, severing the last, perverse tether to humanity. Volkov's use of sound design in this conclusion will be crucial in conveying the emotional vacuum. The expansive, desolate landscape will be filled not with dramatic orchestral swells, but with oppressive silence broken only by the raw, pathetic sounds of Victor's failing body, labored breathing, the rustle of inadequate clothing against rock, the creature's measured, almost silent footsteps. This sonic austerity forces the audience to lean in, to actively participate in the horror of isolation, rejecting the easy, emotional manipulation of a sweeping score. The final sound might be the sharp, sudden cessation of Victor's breathing, followed by the almost imperceptible sound of the creature turning away, the sound of absolute finality swallowed instantly by the vast emptiness they inhabit. The film refuses to offer moral resolution through martyrdom. Instead, it offers the bleak certainty that certain ambitions, when divorced from shared human vulnerability, simply consume their architects and leave behind only cold evidence of failure. The legacy of the Frankenstein 2025 narrative, under Volkov's stark direction, rests heavily on how it frames the creature's subsequent existence. Having dispatched his creator, the creature is left not with freedom, but with an overwhelming expanse of responsibility for his own meaning. This final phase must avoid the conventional sequel setup of immediate further destruction. Instead, it should explore the profound burden of self-determination for an entity born of rage and unnatural origins. Reed's physical presence in this aftermath will be key. The sheer power that once terrified Victor must now feel almost superfluous. The creature possesses the tools to reshape the world, yet lacks the fundamental human blueprints for community and purpose that Victor denied him. One imagines the creature making a conscious decision to withdraw entirely from the human sphere, retreating to landscapes that mirror his internal state. Perhaps the deep ocean trenches or uninhabited polar regions, places where his physical anomaly is irrelevant because there is no society to judge him. His intellect, which allowed him to master philosophy and rhetoric, will now be turned inward, perhaps seeking understanding not through observation of others, but through pure detached contemplation of the universe's indifference. This final solitude, transforms the creature from a vengeful outcast into a tragic, self-imposed monastic figure, perhaps the most intellectually honest being in the film, having understood the true cost of ambition. Clara Song's Elizabeth, though deceased, could receive a final symbolic recognition from the creature. Perhaps he visits her grave, not out of guilt for Victor, but out of a quiet respect for the one person who represented genuine, uncompromised human love that Victor abandoned. This subtle acknowledgement would serve as the creature's final lesson to the audience, that the capacity for pure affection, which he briefly glimpsed, was the true source of life, not the chaotic energy Victor manipulated. This momentary pause would demonstrate that the creature is capable of nuanced moral calculus, a stark contrast to the simplistic, ego-driven motivations of his creator. Ultimately, Volkov's Frankenstein will succeed by refusing to equate creation with accomplishment. The film asserts that true monstrosity resides in the intentional severance of creative responsibility from compassion. Thorne's Victor becomes the ultimate cautionary tale of the isolated genius, while Reed's creature emerges as the painful embodiment of what happens when existential need is met only with intellectual disdain. The film's enduring power will stem from its refusal to offer easy villains, instead presenting a tragedy where every character, driven by flawed human impulses, pride, fear, and the desperate need for connection, contributes inexorably to the ruin. The silence following Victor's demise is the film's final statement. The world continues, unaffected, indifferent to the private apocalypse waged by one man's catastrophic hubris. The enduring resonance of the creature's final, self-imposed exile demands an analysis of the film's conclusion as a statement on identity formation in isolation. If the creature retreats to the elemental wilderness, his interactions will be entirely with forces that demand no social contract: the wind, the stone, the relentless tides. This is not a defeat, but a radical redefinition of existence. Reed's performance in these final sequences must shift from the articulation of justified anger to a profound, almost geological stillness. He is no longer reacting to humanity. He is simply being a conscious entity existing outside the metrics of acceptance or rejection that Victor's world imposed. This speaks directly to contemporary debates about neurodiversity and the marginalization of those whose consciousness operates outside established norms. The creature becomes the ultimate symbol of the self that survives systemic invalidation. Volkov might employ visual juxtaposition here. Vast, untamed landscapes contrasted subtly with fragmented residual images of human civilization glimpsed from afar. A distant light, the sound of a faraway engine. These moments confirm that the creature retains full cognitive awareness of the society that spurned him, making his withdrawal an active, deliberate political act against the exclusivity of human connection, rather than a mere flight from persecution. He refuses to validate their social hierarchy by continuing to fight for a place within it. The ghost of Henri Clerval, as the pure, uncorrupted ideal Victor failed to uphold, will linger most painfully in the creature's memory. While Elizabeth represented the warmth of human love Victor rejected, Clerval represented the ethical potential of shared intellectual pursuit. The creature might find a discarded text or a half-finished scientific notation left by Clerval, and in studying it, recognize the possibility of a different outcome had Victor chosen collaboration over conquest. This subtle realization elevates the creature beyond simple revenge. He embodies the sorrow of what might have been for all of humanity, not just for himself. In the final assessment, Frankenstein 2025 utilizes its modern lens to argue that creation without empathy is not scientific progress, but a uniquely modern form of suicide. The film's chilling triumph lies in its refusal to grant the creature a neat resolution, be it acceptance or complete self-destruction. Instead, it posits the hardest path, perpetual conscious existence as an outsider, eternally observing the warm, messy world from which he was designed to be excluded. The film is a profound meditation on the responsibility of the inventor, suggesting that the true horror is not the assembled flesh, but the arrogance required to believe that one can engineer a soul and then refuse to nurture it. The silence that descends over the final frame is the sound of the future, vast and utterly lonely, waiting for the next brilliant mind to make the same fatal mistake. The lingering philosophical weight of the creature's self-imposed exile forces a consideration of his narrative closure as an act of self-authorship, a theme likely emphasized by Volkov's affinity for existential drama. Having outlived Victor, the creature effectively completes Shelley's narrative arc by reclaiming authorship over his own story, moving from an object of Victor's scientific ego to a subject defining his own fate. Reed's performance must convey the immense intellectual labor involved in forging an identity without precedent or societal mirror. This state of ultimate autonomy, however, is steeped in sorrow. He possesses infinite freedom within a landscape that offers no corresponding emotional resonance. He is the ultimate post-human being, unbound by biology or society, yet existentially impoverished. The final symbolic gesture might involve the creature interacting with an artifact from Victor's life, perhaps a personal journal or a portrait of Elizabeth, not to destroy it, but to examine it with the detached precision of an archaeologist studying a long-dead civilization. This examination serves as his final testament, a complete and objective understanding of the human capacity for both profound creation and catastrophic neglect. His lack of overt malice in this moment is perhaps more terrifying than any previous violence, suggesting that he has moved beyond vengeance into a realm of weary, absolute judgment. He understands Victor better than Victor ever understood himself, recognizing the inventor's tragic dependency on external validation. Volkov will likely use the soundscape one final time to punctuate this isolation. Should the creature choose to destroy Victor's scientific documentation, the physical record of his transgression, the act will be rendered with meticulous, almost ritualistic care, emphasizing the necessary cleansing of the intellectual poison that contaminated Victor. There will be no ecstatic release in the destruction of the notes, only the solemnity of erasing a dangerous historical precedent. The film suggests that genius, when untethered from humility, leaves behind only ruins, and the creature becomes the reluctant custodian of those ruins. In conclusion, Frankenstein 2025 appears poised to transcend the familiar Gothic horror framework, utilizing contemporary anxieties about artificial intelligence and bioengineering to reinterrogate Shelley's timeless warning. Thorne's Victor embodies the hubris of the contemporary tech titan, while Reed's creature functions as the painful, undeniable consequence of prioritizing intellectual achievement over human connection. The film's lasting impact will reside in its bleak assertion that the greatest creation is not the mastery of life's secrets, but the successful navigation of one's moral obligations to that which one brings into existence. The final chilling emptiness that engulfs the creature is the film's thesis. Absolute freedom achieved at the cost of belonging is simply another, more desolate form of imprisonment. The narrative's unflinching commitment to this bleakness suggests that any final, lingering shot of the creature must be inherently contradictory, a figure of supreme power rendered utterly powerless by his lack of context. If Reed's creature finally gazes upon the stars, a traditional symbol of infinite possibility, his reaction will be one of weary resignation rather than awe. He has mastered the physics and the chemistry of the cosmos through stolen knowledge, yet the simple act of feeling part of that grand design remains eternally beyond his grasp. His physical form, the composite masterpiece of Victor's ambition, becomes an ironic monument to failed synthesis, a perfectly assembled structure devoid of the animating force of shared experience. Thorne's Victor, even in death, casts a long shadow through the narrative's thematic echoes. The film might employ subtle auditory hallucinations for the audience during the final moments, fleeting whispers of Elizabeth's sorrow or Clerval's earnest questioning, layered just beneath the sound of the wind. These are the voices of the life Victor intentionally silenced, now manifesting as psychic residue in the environment the creature inhabits. This reinforces that Victor's destruction was merely the physical termination of a relationship that had already been mortally wounded by psychological abandonment years prior. Volkov's visual palette for the creature's final moments will likely strip away all vestiges of the Gothic spectacle that marked the film's opening. Gone are the dramatic shadows and electrical arcs. Instead, we might see the creature silhouetted against a stark, high-contrast landscape, perhaps the blinding white of untouched snow or the flat, gray expanse of an endless desert horizon. The focus is on texture and scale, the smallness of one conscious being against the massive indifference of nature, a philosophical tableau rather than a horror scene. His very existence in this final state serves as the film's ultimate critique of the 21st century myth of the solitary genius, that true success is measured not by the height of one's ascent, but by the quality of the bridges one builds on the way up. The ultimate tragedy, therefore, is that the creature, through his long, painful education, becomes the film's most emotionally intelligent character. He understands the necessity of connection, the fragility of trust, and the moral imperative of responsibility, lessons that Victor, for all his genius, never managed to assimilate. The creature doesn't seek to become human. He seeks the benefits of humanity, belonging, recognition, without the messy, compromising vulnerability required to attain them. His failure to find these benefits makes him the perfect, tragic mirror to Victor's failure to acknowledge them, leaving the audience with the chilling realization that perhaps, in the cold calculus of existence, Victor's creation was simply too honest for the world he was forced into. The film concludes not with a monster vanquished, but with a complex, suffering intellect enduring alone, a silence far heavier than any scream. The narrative thread surrounding Clerval's memory and its subtle haunting of the creature's solitude provides the final, necessary layer of emotional complexity. If the creature, in his self-imposed exile, were to encounter a landscape or a remnant of nature that Henry Clerval had once championed, perhaps a meticulously organized botanical garden now overgrown and reclaimed by the wild, it would serve as a potent trigger. Reed's portrayal here would demand an unprecedented stillness, a momentary suspension of his immense physical presence. His large hands, which once crushed flowers in clumsy attempts at appreciation, might tentatively touch a surviving, resilient bloom in this abandoned place. This encounter is not about vengeance against Clerval. Clerval was never Victor's antagonist. Instead, it is the creature confronting the possibility of an uncorrupted fraternity. He recognizes that Clerval represented a pathway Victor actively discarded, a science dedicated to nurturing, not dominating. The creature's internal dialogue, perhaps conveyed through minimalist, barely audible vocalizations, a soft, questioning murmur, reveals the agonizing realization that he was created by a man incapable of appreciating the very virtues Clerval embodied. The creature, who learned cruelty through experience, is forced to process the beauty of a goodness he was structurally prevented from accessing. Volkov would treat this sequence with excruciating slowness, utilizing shallow focus to draw the audience's attention away from the grand landscape and onto the minute detail of the creature's interaction with the plant life. This intimacy highlights the creature's inherent capacity for appreciation, making his monstrous reputation feel less like an inherent state and more like a tragic, imposed identity. It becomes clear that the creature doesn't simply hate Victor. He grieves for the potential of the entire human project that Victor's ego poisoned. The film's overarching philosophical argument solidifies here. Victor Frankenstein did not merely violate natural law, he violated the law of human relationality. He murdered Clerval not with poison or fire, but by consistently choosing his solitary obsession over genuine, supportive companionship. The creature, in mourning the idealized reflection of Victor that Clerval represented, becomes the last guardian of Victor's lost moral potential. The final silence of the creature, therefore, is not emptiness, but a deep, self-imposed commitment to remember the possibility of good, even as he exists perpetually outside its sphere. This final, quiet reverence for the memory of Clerval ensures that the film ends not just with the horror of creation, but with the profound tragedy of abandoned virtue. Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Territory of Cinema channel. We are so glad to have you here with us today. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are diving deep to discuss the upcoming film, Frankenstein 2025. The flickering gaslight of a 19th-century German university laboratory casts long, dancing shadows as young Victor Frankenstein, driven by an almost feverish ambition, pores over forbidden texts. His academic journey, deeply influenced by the Enlightenment's relentless pursuit of knowledge, yet haunted by the Romantic era's embrace of the sublime and the terrifying, has led him down a path few contemporaries dare tread. He sees not mere anatomy, but the very spark of life itself, a secret he believes is his destiny to unlock. His studies in Ingolstadt, fueled by early fascination with galvanism and the burgeoning field of electrical science, echoing, perhaps, the practical experiments of contemporary figures like Humphrey Davy, culminate in a moment of chilling success. Victor, isolated and increasingly pale from sleepless nights, manages to animate the patchwork corpse assembled from graveyard scavengings. The creature, hulking and grotesque, draws its first breath, not with a triumphant roar, but a shuddering, confused gasp. The immediate reaction is not pride, but visceral terror. Victor flees, abandoning his creation to the world. This act of supreme creative irresponsibility sets the stage for the tragedy. The creature, initially possessing a childlike innocence and a desperate desire for connection, is thrust into a world that recoils from his appearance. We follow the creature's agonizing education. His time spent observing the de Lacy family in their humble cottage, hidden behind a makeshift screen, is pivotal. He learns language, morality, and the crushing weight of human society by listening to Felix read histories and poetry. His burgeoning intellect, a dark mirror to Victor's own genius, makes his subsequent rejection all the more profound. When he finally reveals himself seeking only acceptance, the family's horror confirms his absolute otherness. Meanwhile, Victor, recovering from a near-fatal illness brought on by the shock of his creation, tries desperately to return to normalcy, burying his secret beneath the veneer of familial happiness with his gentle cousin, Elizabeth. But the creature, vengeful and intelligent, begins his campaign of retribution. William, Victor's younger brother, becomes the first sacrifice, murdered in a fit of rage catalyzed by the creature's existential despair. The narrative then fractures, shifting focus between Victor's frantic attempts to silence his past and the creature's calculated pursuit of his creator across Europe. Victor's ill-fated marriage to Elizabeth ends in tragedy on their wedding night, the creature fulfilling his promise to destroy everything Victor holds dear. This sequence is imbued with a Gothic grandeur, a final, devastating consequence of Victor's hubris. The final act takes Victor into the desolate wastes of the Arctic. Driven by an obsession bordering on madness, he is hunting his creation, driven by a desire for vengeance that mirrors the creature's own early desire for understanding. It is here, in the icebound silence, that Robert Walton finds Victor, a broken man clinging to life, consumed by his singular destructive quest. Walton, an explorer seeking glory and a passage through the northern ice, becomes the final confidant. He hears the tale from Victor's dying lips, a cautionary epic woven from ambition and guilt. After Victor's death, the creature finally appears aboard Walton's ship, In a moment of profound, sorrowful eloquence, he surveys the wreckage of his maker's life and his own miserable existence. Recognizing the futility of further bloodshed, the creature vows to extinguish the last ember of his unnatural life, vanishing into the endless, unforgiving polar night, leaving Walton with a horrifying testament to the perils of unchecked genius. The air in Ingolstadt was thick with the smell of formaldehyde and the electric tang of impending discovery, a heady mix that intoxicated the young Frankenstein. He moved through his cramped chambers like a somnambulist, his sketches revealing an almost religious fervor for anatomical perfection, a quest for the secret mechanism that separated the mundane clay of a corpse from the animating breath of existence. One can sense in his obsessive tunneling through medical journals and electrical treatises the spirit of the era's scientific heroes, yet filtered through a distinctly romantic sensibility. A desire not just to understand nature, but to master its most sacred processes, perhaps even to usurp the divine. When the culmination of his sleepless nights finally stood before him, it was not a beautiful Apollo he had summoned, but a thing of crude, mismatched parts, its very form a testament to the compromises inherent in forbidden creation. The initial surge of life was less a miracle and more a violation. Victor's recoil, that instantaneous, feverish abandonment, speaks volumes about the fragile nature of his courage. The ambition to create was immense, but the responsibility to nurture, to guide the nascent consciousness, was a burden too heavy for his egotistical frame. He ran not just from the creature, but from the unanswerable question the creature represented. What now? The creature's initial movements were those of a newborn grappling with an impossibly complex world. His experience observing the de Lacys was a masterclass in unearned suffering. Hidden in the hovel, absorbing Felix's passionate readings of Milton and Plutarch, the creature developed an internal life of extraordinary depth. This was not merely brute strength learning manners. This was a complex philosophical soul being forged in the crucible of observed rejection. His eloquence, once he finally found a voice, was the direct result of this intense solitary study, making his subsequent isolation a far more tragic affair than if he had remained an ignorant brute. His sorrow was articulated, his rage was intellectualized. The descent into madness for Victor was characterized by a frantic need to plaster over the gaping wound of his secret. His marriage to Elizabeth, meant to be an anchor to sanity and normalcy, became instead the ultimate target for the creature's spiraling despair. Elizabeth herself is often depicted as the embodiment of pure, unsuspecting goodness, a prize of conventional life that the creature, by his very existence, is condemned to destroy. Her death, stark and horrifying on that wedding night, is the ultimate proof that Victor's act of creation irrevocably poisoned every corner of his world. The pursuit across the desolate landscape, culminating in the frozen, unforgiving expanse of the Arctic, transforms Victor from scientist to hunter, obsessed with erasing his mistake. He becomes, in essence, the creature's shadow, mirroring the obsessive focus the creature once directed toward achieving acceptance. Robert Walton, the pragmatic explorer yearning for scientific renown and the glory of discovery,